Senior Pastor of the True Holiness Saints Center in the beautiful city of Conway, Arkansas. And you know what time it is. It is Wednesday Word time. So what is our Wednesday Word for tonight, Pastor Malbia? Our Wednesday Word for tonight is grief. More specifically, I want to talk to you about how to cope with the grief in your life. So what is grief, Pastor Malbia? Grief can simply be defined as the suffering you experience when someone or something immensely important is taken away from you. That's grief. Grief can be triggered by the loss of a loved one, but grief can also be triggered by the loss of something you deem immensely important. So tonight, this is what I want to do. Whether you're the person who is experiencing grief, or perhaps you're that supporter trying to help someone walk through grief, I want to share with you 3 tips you can use to cope with and manage your grief. So if you're writing notes, write this down. Tip number 1. When you're the person experiencing grief, tip number 1 is this: avoid making any hasty decisions. Now that's good teaching. If you are presently in the midst of grief, avoid making any hasty or rushed decisions. Proverbs 19:2 says it like this: desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will a hasty feet? Hasty feet simply means a quick decision. How much more will a quick decision cause you to miss the way? See, when you're experiencing grief, the grief over someone you love, the grief over something you miss, whether it's a loved one, a job, a dream, or a host of any other meaningful activities, in that moment of pain, in that season of confusion, you will be tempted to rush to a decision. And if you're not careful, you will base that decision on your emotions, on the pain you're going through, on the fear or anxiety you're experiencing. For example, when a loved one dies and you're in the midst of the shock of it all, when you're in the midst of what I call the dense emotional fog, you'll be trying to consider next steps. You'll be trying to determine, what should I do next? What shall I sell? What should I keep? What should I give away? In the midst of the grief, you'll be trying to determine if you should remain where you are or should you relocate, if things should stay a certain way or if you should change them. But whatever you do in the midst of grief, don't make any hasty decisions. Hear me, church. Unless the decision is unavoidable and it's under intense time constraints, don't make any life-altering decisions for the first few weeks. Wait until the initial shock has passed. Wait until you're able to think logically more than emotionally. Furthermore, don't allow any well-meaning people, or even predators for that example. Don't let any well-meaning people or people that are trying to beat you cause you to make or cause you to rush into a bad decision. In fact, I encourage you to write this down in the comment section. Maybe put it in your personal notes, but write this phrase down. Do what's best, not what's sentimental. Now that's good teaching. In the midst of your grief, when you're making life-altering decisions, you've got to be clear-headed enough to do what's best, not what's sentimental. In fact, maybe this is a good place for me to share with you our social media quote for tonight. Your social media quote for tonight is simply this: think with your head and not with your heart. That's good teaching. When you're in the midst of grief and you have to make life-altering or life-significant decisions, you've got to be prepared to think with your heart, think with your head, and certainly not your heart. So the first thing you need to do to cope with grief is to avoid making any hasty decisions. But then secondly, when someone you love is experiencing grief and you're doing all you can to help them through the journey, the second tip is this: let's talk about how to help those who grieve. How to help those who grieve. The Bible says these words in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11. The Apostle Paul says, "Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just in fact, as you're doing already." See, the reality of the matter is this, church. When people experience the painful loss of a loved one, when people experience the painful loss of something meaningful in their lives, God will often use other people's concern and comfort to help guide them through the pathway to healing. Here's what I know for sure. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. When Jesus wants to do something in this world, he often works through his children. And when we know people who are grieving, when we know people who are racked with pain, when we know people who are dealing with the loss of something meaningful, oftentimes God will use you to escort them to a place of healing. So how do we most effectively express our concern and our comfort for those who are hurting? Here's just a few ideas. Phone calls, text messages, emails, personal visits. You can send them a card. You can send them a care package. But here's the goal. You want them to know that you care enough to pause what you're doing long enough to acknowledge the pain and the loss that they're going through. That's the message. Whatever you do, you want to do it immediately. You want to do it as soon as appropriate to do. You want to call sooner rather than later. You want to text sooner rather than later, because you want them to know that their loved one is important enough, or that they are important enough for you to pause everything you're doing to say, I acknowledge your loss. I'm praying for you during this time of bereavement. And when you communicate with that person, whether through email or text or personal phone call or visit, whenever you communicate with them, let that person vent. Let that person cry, and do so without judging them. Be that sounding board while they're grappling through the wide range of painful and frustrating emotions. Sometimes all people need is someone to listen. Sometimes all they need is a safe environment to vent their true feelings. They don't always need advice. They don't always need encouragement. They need a listening ear. That's what you can be. When we are the feet and the hands of Jesus, we're there to communicate. We acknowledge your loss, and we are a safe place for you to release your emotions. Not only do you communicate with them, not only do you send a very strong message that you are important enough for me to pause my day to say and acknowledge your loss. But another thing you can do for them, you can find helpful ways of helping out without being asked. Now let me say that again. You can find helpful ways and helpful things to do without being asked. Oftentimes when people are going through loss, we use the old cliche, if you need anything, call me. If you need anything, let me know. But if you really want to be a help, you'll find something to do without necessarily being asked. Think about things that you can do that right now in the middle of grief, they don't feel like doing for themselves. Maybe it's making a meal for them or sending them a meal card so they can get them a dinner. Maybe it's taking out the trash. Maybe it's helping tidy up around the house. Maybe it's cutting the yard. Maybe it's offering to babysit their children to give them a little time to process alone. Maybe it's as simple as going to the grocery store and shopping for them or getting some needed supplies. Maybe if it's appropriate, you can even offer to accompany them to the funeral home. But always remember these words. Small, thoughtful, loving gestures go a long way to reducing stress during times of grief. Just those small, simple gestures of love go a long way to handle the burden of pain. Tip number 1, you've got to avoid making any hasty decisions when you're overwhelmed by grief. Tip number 2, when you're trying to be a support of those who are grieving, find helpful ways to help out. And here's the last tip, and I'm going to get out of here. Whether you're the person grieving or the support system for the person grieving, tip number 3, find comfort in God. Yeah. When it's all said and done, we need to focus so we can find comfort in our God. One of the most comforting scriptures that I go to when times of grief come is Psalms 34 and 18. The Bible says these words: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Translation: don't you ever forget that God is our source. He's our source of joy. He's our source of peace. He's our source of resilience. He's our source of wisdom. And most importantly, He is our source of comfort. God is always there, willing and able to help navigate you through the painful process of grief. In conclusion this morning, dear hearts, if you're currently grieving or you're trying to be a support system for those who are grieving, we need to look to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. Only He can wipe our tears away. Only He can restore our peace of mind. Only He that can provide true comfort in moments of overwhelming loss. The Wednesday word today is grief. More specifically, coping with the grief in your life. If you're presently grieving the loss of a loved one or something else you hold dear, don't make any hasty decisions. If you're a person out there trying to be supportive to those who are grieving, find helpful ways to do so. But on whatever end of the spectrum you're on, look to God for comfort.